Can you guys hear me okay? I need it in this range, I think. So I'm Robin Green. I'm with the Kentucky Department for Environmental Protection, Solid Waste Branch, and I'm here today to talk about Kentucky's regulations for composting facilities. So the baseline for Kentucky regulations is in statute, and the statutes, the Kentucky Revised Statute 224, authorizes the Cabinet, the Energy and Environment Cabinet, to develop regulations for composting, which we have done so. They govern the operation of composting facilities and the certification of compost facility operators. I'm going to switch here. That's probably better. So an overview from that, the Kentucky administrative regulations were developed pursuant to that statute, and these regulations provide specific details for composting facilities. One thing that applies to all composting facilities and really all waste management facilities are the environmental performance standards. And I don't have a slide that lists all of them because they go on for several portions, but just to give you an overview, these are kind of the general commandments for how to operate a facility that manages waste in Kentucky. So they have protections for things like surface water, groundwater, endangered species, karst. Is anybody familiar with the term karst? Maybe if I said sinkholes or caves. So karst is a layer or a description of geology that is subject to having fractures in it that allow for the creation of caves. And in Kentucky, we have various regions of the state that have karst underlying, and that can lead to the rapid transmission of materials through the system and could be a potential pathway for pollution. So we're very concerned about that. So KRS at the top are the statutes, and I hope this slide is visible from the back, but I wanted to illustrate here that on the left-hand side, we have the solid waste regulations, and on the right-hand side, we have the special waste regulations. So the statute authorized the Cabinet to develop solid waste, so we have Chapter 47 and 48 for solid waste, and then for special waste, which I'll describe here shortly, we have Chapters 45 and 30. So they're parallel, I guess, structures for permitting. As an overview, waste in general, so the waste that we might generate at our homes, the waste that's generated at businesses, all the different sources of waste can be categorized generally as hazardous and non-hazardous. Anybody want to compost hazardous waste? I would hope not. So non-hazardous wastes are then further subdivided into solid waste and special waste. Solid wastes that are suitable for composting would be things like yard waste, food waste, paper waste, the kind of things that we might generate on a regular basis at our homes and businesses. Special waste is defined by statute, and that's the statutory reference there. There's a longer definition for the purposes of composting. The only special waste that I think would be relevant would be waste that is generated by wastewater treatment plants. So the sludge that is generated at the end of that process from the things that we put into the sewers can be used to make compost. Has anyone here looked into or had any interest in special waste composting, composting of sludges? Okay. So to give you a general overview, as I mentioned before, there are two different tracks. For solid waste, the type of permit that you would get is called a registered permit by rule, and what that means is that the process is a little bit shorter, the form is not as long, and for special waste facilities, those that are going to be composting sludge from wastewater treatment plants, we call it a full permit. So it's a longer process, it's a bit more involved when you're dealing with all the things that people can flush down the toilet or discharge to our wastewater treatment plants. For the solid waste permitting process, so for people who want to compost things like yard waste, food waste, the form that you would need to use is DEP, so that's Department for Environmental Protection, Form 07059A. So it's one form, and you do have to do a public notice. You have to do a public notice for both, but for solid waste, a public notice is run in your local paper. We give you a template for how to do it, and you're notifying the people in your community that you're proposing to conduct this type of waste activity. That is your opportunity. You can put in the notice. We recommend you put in the notice. It's in the template to put your contact information so people can call you up and ask you questions. Hey, what are you doing? Where is this going to be? You know, and also contact information for me, for my branch, so they can call me up and ask, what is this kind of permit? What are they allowed to do? So it notifies the people in your community. Now, you can on your own, and I highly recommend, contact your local government, contact the people in your community, talk to them about what you want to do. Educate them, let them know, because I think it's good for you to interface with your local community and tell them from your perspective why you're doing what you want to do. Occasionally people have concerns, and if you can interface with them and talk to them one-on-one, I think that's a great way to educate and let them know why you're doing what you want to do. The regulation for solid waste says that you must have a permit if you are preparing compost for distribution. If you are making compost to use on your own property, you do not have to have a permit from my branch to do that. You could get one if you wanted to, but you are not required to. But when you make compost that you are distributing either for free or for sale, you need to have a permit from the state to do that. I don't have a slide for this, but I will mention I'm only representing the regulations and the requirements at the state level. Your municipality, your city, your local government may have solid waste ordinances, and you would need to check with them. I can't keep track of the ordinances for every single county in the state, so I highly recommend you talk to your local solid waste coordinator and find out. They may have a permitting process. They may have fees. They may have additional requirements, and a permit that you get from my branch does not override or supersede any local requirements that you have. So I would talk to them as well. I got ahead of myself. So as I mentioned, you have to comply with the environmental performance standards, protecting things like surface water, groundwater, and karst, endangered species, and you must comply with any local local land use or zoning ordinances. So once you do your public notice, it is possible that I could get a call from someone who could say, well, I have a concern about this facility. I think that there might be an endangered species nearby that could be impacted, and therefore I want to have a public meeting. So if someone requests that, we, the cabinet, the solid waste branch, will put on the public meeting. We'll allow people to come in and make comments, and then as part of the permitting process, we will address those comments when we make our final determination. The reason I mention it is it could extend the permitting process by a couple of months in order to have that meeting. There's a potential that someone could bring up something that could cause us to have to deny the permit. They could give us information that could lead to a determination that the facility may not be able to operate in compliance with the regulations. So if you get out and talk to your community ahead of time, you may be able to find out about those concerns before you get into the permitting process. We could also add special conditions onto the permit to help you comply with the regulations, taking whatever concerns your local community brought up in order to issue you a permit that is specified to those conditions. While you're operating, there are certain things you have to do to stay in compliance. You do need to track various things about the operation of your facility, the volumes of material that you receive, the analyses that you do at the end of the process for nutrients and metals in your materials, the time and temperature logs. So how long was the compost held at certain temperatures in order to reduce pathogens? Who did you distribute it to? You'll need to track who received amounts of the finished compost material, and then there may be additional information required by your permit. We'll put it in there that says you need to track this and submit it when you submit your annual report. At some point, you may decide you're finished making compost. At that time, you would send us a letter. I would accept an email, that's fine, and say you're finished. All the compost has been distributed, you're not going to be making any more compost, and you request that we do a closure inspection. We send an inspector out, they certify that everything is cleared off and good, and we will terminate your permit. Okay, so I think I'm supposed to be going till 9:55? Okay. Special waste permitting is a little more involved, as I mentioned. So you need to do, the first step is a notice of intent, where you generally give us the information about the facility, about your property, where you're going to be receiving special waste for composting. Once we have reviewed that and determined which type you are, which I'll get into in a moment, then you submit a second form, the application for the facility, that gives us more detailed information about the location, the geology of the site, and how you're going to operate, and also past performance information. Past performance is basically if you've operated a waste site in the past, what was your history, your track record of operating that site. So here, the statute requires that if you're composting special waste, you must issue a public notice. Very similar to the public notice I mentioned previously, you run a small ad in the paper notifying your local community that you're going to be operating this kind of facility and you're going to be receiving wastewater treatment plant sludge for composting. Again, it should have your contact information and my contact information so people can let us know if they have questions. By statute, if you're going to compost wastewater treatment plant sludge, you have to be in what is an industrial zoned property. So that is a special consideration. You may need to collaborate with your local government to find a property that would be suitable for this type of activity. Once we receive your notice of intent, we decide whether it's a type A or type B facility. That's determined based upon the volume of material you want to receive and the specific chemical characteristics of that material. Primarily, we're looking at heavy metals. So with sludge, you're receiving everything that people send to the sewage system, and in some cases, that sludge might have elevated copper or nickel or lead or cadmium. And those are the kind of things that we're looking at. The type A is the one that has higher levels of metals, and because of that, we would require that facility to have groundwater monitoring. So wells have to go in to track the groundwater moving through that site to make sure that no contaminants are leaving your site. And also financial assurance, which means a bond, a letter of credit, so that if something happens and you're unable to remediate it, we have that funding available at the state level to do that remediation. Because of this, we have vanishingly few type A facilities. Most of the facilities are going to be type B, where these two requirements will not be in place. So we've received your notice of intent, we've received your regular application, we review it. The next stage is to do a draft construction permit, and we could, upon reviewing the information again, it's always an option that we could do a notice of intent to deny because we don't feel the facility would meet the requirements. I talked about financial assurance a little bit earlier, so that's money that you put up in order to make sure that the site can be closed properly. And we issue you a permit that is for a fixed term not to exceed 10 years. So every 10 years, we reevaluate the permit and decide if we want to continue it. You send in a renewal application, we look at that, and we'll either renew your permit or terminate your permit. Similar to a solid waste facility, during your operation, you have to track data regarding how you're operating, the volumes, the analysis for nutrients and metals, and any other parameters that we have concerns about, your time and temperature logs to show that you've reduced your pathogens, who you've distributed it to, and any information that we put in your permit that we require you to track. Similar to a solid waste, you submit a closure report. The closure report is a little bit more detailed. You track everything that you have done through the life of the site. You summarize that all and send that to us as your closure report. You certify that you've done everything you need to do. You may need to do soil analyses to show the levels of metal in the soil at the site. You certify that it's compliance with all regulations. And then we might enter into a post-closure period afterwards to make sure that there are no ongoing effects. If you have any groundwater contamination, you would have to correct that. And once you have done all of those things and we've certified that there are no things that need to be remediated, we would release the financial assurance. So it's not as if it's money that you put up and you lose. It's just we hold on to it in case it's needed. Both types of facilities need to have a certified operator. That is handled by our Division of Compliance Assistance. So they generally do schools in the spring. So once a year, you would come to Frankfurt, you would attend the school. It's 2 or 3 days generally. And at the end of that, I haven't found exactly the right place to hold this. At the end of that, you would need to pass an exam in order to demonstrate that you have learned the material, and then you would get your operator certification. Yes?
I have a question about those trainings on the application online that requires a license number to be input, is from what I remember.
Okay.
Can you still apply even if you don't, if you're operating on a private farm and you're not distributing, can you still become a certified compost operator, or, for example, like myself in an extension position with university,
Uh-huh.
I feel like it could still be beneficial for me to go through that certification, and I work with our solid waste coordinator at the county. Yeah, I don't know. But is it possible to attend the certification course and become certified without being associated with a licensed or permitted facility? Does that make sense?
I believe it is, yes. I would defer to the Division for Compliance Assistance. I would refer you to talk to them, but as far as I know, the certification goes with you. It does not go with a particular site. So you could be a certified operator and be responsible for a couple of different sites. You could be assigned to one site. So the operator certification goes to an individual. So I do not believe you would need to have any particular site that you were either responsible for or considering in order to get that operator certification. But I would defer to them. They're the ones that know those regulations better than I do. Sure. Did not realize I split this slide up. Oh, too far. Okay. So I feel like I ran through that kind of quickly, but I just wanted to give you an overview of the regulations. If you have any particular questions about a form, I'm happy to get with you, or we can send an inspector out if you have any siting concerns or questions about where on a property might be the best place to operate your composting. Yes?
I had a question about composting spent grains.
Okay.
Distilling.
Mm-hmm.
Does that require a permit if you're just in-house keeping it, you're not distributing the compost?
Great question. So if you receive material, spent grains in this particular case, and the compost that you make is only used on the property where the compost is made, it would not be distributed, and you would not be required to have a permit. Now, I will say the caveat there is, for any of these solid waste sites, if you are composting and we get a complaint, an inspector comes out and sees that there's a problem, the cabinet has the ability to, at that point, require a permit to help you be in compliance. So you would not automatically be required to have a permit for receiving spent grains as long as the compost was used on the site where it was made, unless we had a problem. They have special challenges due to the characteristics of the spent grains. And I will say that if the spent grains go into a lagoon before they are composted, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend, but our Division of Water has determined that that constitutes wastewater treatment, so then that would put you in the special waste category. I don't think, I mean, I'll defer to people who have better technical knowledge on composting than I do, but I do not think it would be beneficial to put spent grains in a lagoon and then dredge them back out to compost. Yeah.
I have a question about how that permitting kind of dovetails with the ag water quality plan.
Okay.
I've had past experiences with some compost and application of spent grains on land, and I was told by a gentleman in your division that they needed a nutrient management plan to actually plan to apply.
So yes, that is a potential issue. The Division of Water would be the ones who would be able to give you more detailed information, but to the best of my ability, the Ag Water Quality Act applies to farms over a certain acreage, and I think it might be 10 acres. So if you had a farm that was over 10 acres, you would be required to have a nutrient management plan, and the nutrient management plan has to account for all nutrient inputs, including compost. So if you were generating compost and applying that, that would have to be part of your nutrient management plan with all your other inputs of nutrients. Does that answer your
Yes,
question?
that answers my question.
Okay,
Thank you.
sure. Anything else? Yeah.
I guess just simple question, volumes of compost, it said required track information. One was volumes of composted material.
Mm-hmm.
Does that include, like your browns and your greens? Or just your nitrogen source, your green material?
It would be both. The forms are a little bit different for solid waste and special waste. To the best of my recollection, I should have brought example forms in to show you guys. I believe the solid waste form tracks it by types of waste incoming. So there might be a column for leaves, a column for manure, a column for all the different inputs, and then by month. So that would be how you'd track the volumes. The special waste form is probably volumes of special waste coming in on a monthly basis and doesn't break it out into those categories. Does that answer your question? Okay. All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I put some business cards on one of the tables back there. Feel free to take one with you. And if you need to get in touch or have any further questions, I'm happy to help.
Thank you. You did outstanding. Thank you very much. So how does the state look at home composting, the homeowners and all that good stuff?
If it's not distributed, you can make as much compost from your own household waste. Should I take the microphone back? Or can you guys hear me?
Yeah. You should business cards right here?
Yeah, my business cards are right there. Feel free to help yourself. We're not looking to regulate people who are composting their leaves or their kitchen scraps in their backyard. We would only be requiring a permit there again if there was a compliance issue. So if you want to have a compost bin in your backyard, you don't need to talk to me about that unless you think you want my technical assistance. So no, you do not need to have a permit for that.
You might have compost bin systems at a community compost.
Uh-huh, yeah.
So can you speak to that? Do you need a permit for like a 3-bin unit that's on a community garden site that neighbors can be bringing, people that are gardening there can be bringing in their food scraps so that they have more material?
You would only need a permit if it was distributed. So if it was distributed. So if the material's coming in to some compost bins at a community site and it's being used on gardens on that site, you are not automatically required to submit the RPBR form and get a composting permit. Once again, I don't want to
Yeah.
belabor it, but if you had an issue, then we could either require you to stop composting, get into compliance, and part of that getting in compliance could be the requirement to get a permit. But you are not automatically required to, for any compost that is made and used on the site that it's made, you do not automatically have to get a permit for that. It is when you are either giving it away or selling it to people away from the site where it is made, then you're required to get a solid waste permit. If you're composting special waste, you're always required to get a permit. Okay? Yep.
Real quick, the price of the permit?
I did not memorize those, but I will say that for a solid waste permit, there is an application fee that is in 47090. That regulation has all of our fees in it, so I don't have them all memorized. I think it's on the order of a few $1,000s for the application, and then there is an annual fee every year that is due while you're in operation that helps pay for the cost of having an inspector come out, and that is due once a year while you're in operation. I'm not sure off the top of my head what that fee is, but I can get with anybody who wants to and get you a link to that. Yes?
State composting grants, do they still a thing?
Yes. That's our recycling and local assistance branch that distributes those grants. I believe they are available for government entities that want to purchase composting equipment. Mm-hmm. Yep.
I believe the state permit is $3,000, the application fee. And so I was just curious, how does that compare to, if you know, to New York or to other states? I've just been told, you know, I have some friends down in Tennessee that have a compost facility, and when they talk about it, I mean, they're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I don't always know what they're referring to, because when I look at Kentucky, our county permit in Warren County, and then our state permit, we're less than $5,000, which is very reasonable to start up a business, in my opinion. So I was just curious if anybody knew how, like, our permitting, you know, economics compared to any outside states. I think it's relevant information because, you know, to start up a business in Kentucky might be less expensive than in surrounding states.
With the mic?
New York, our permits,
We're recording,
Yeah.
yeah.
So in New York, we regulate by process and feedstock. So you do a little bit of feedstock here, but process is more important. We don't need, our people don't need a permit to sell. So we don't regulate the sale of any of it. So I don't know if that answers things. We also regulate so that, like, if a farm wants to compost all their manure and their mortality and all that, they're exempt. They don't have to do that. Cornell University, we have a 4-acre site. We are exempt because it's on our own property and it is all of our own waste, even though it's food waste and manures and all different kinds of stuff. So it depends on who you are. And we also don't count carbon. So when we look at those thresholds, carbon, like leaves, have to be we've chosen as a society to bring them into a central location. So they need to be composted. They're going to be better composted if they have other material mixed with them. We talked a little bit about that yesterday because they're really carbonaceous and we need that nitrogen mixed with them. So the nitrogen is what really counts when we say 5,000 yards or 10,000 yards or whatever. It's the nitrogen, the carbon, we want that. Our regulators want as much carbon on the sites as possible because they know that it's needed for all the other stuff, other processing. Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit, well,
Let me introduce yourself and you can take off.
No, that's okay, let's keep going. We'll do that after. Well,
And then also, Virginia, with that in mind, we're not up here at this camera, we're not videoing this. So I was gonna also suggest that you do take a stand here at the ample, the podium, so we can get you recorded. I didn't realize it until after I sat down.
right.
That's recording that, and it's gonna be up on YouTube. So I also would encourage you, if you don't mind, if you could take it.
To get up there, yep.
As well.
Okay, so when we switch, or right now?
Yeah, however you want to do it, it's up to you.
Okay. I'm going to give
Here's
you,
your clicker.
Robin, the microphone.
Here's your clicker.
Okay. One last clarification, I guess, regarding fees, since that is of concern. By statute, Kentucky does not charge fees to political subdivisions of the Commonwealth. So a publicly owned facility is not subject to application fees or permitting fees. If you have further questions on that, I'd be happy to discuss it, but that might be beyond the scope of what we're talking about right now. So I guess I'll hand it over.
Okay. Your question?
Well, I was just wondering if you could talk very briefly about why you may not want to centrally locate leaf collection. Yeah, what are the implications of collecting and piling leaf litter from municipalities? It sounded like.
What are the implications? So we want people to be collecting the, if it's coming in, if that's the community's decision to do that, we want that material to be coming in, and it should be placed in windrows immediately. So everything goes into windrows no matter what. We stockpile in windrows, and a windrow is a long, narrow pile. It's like this table, but it can be 10 to 14 feet wide. Then that's dependent on your equipment. Size is always dependent on the equipment that you're using. But 10 to 14 feet wide by, as long as you have space, by about 8 feet tall, 8 to 12 feet tall. And there are exceptions for different situations, but your equipment has to be able to turn those piles somehow. Whether it's a windrow turner that has a hoop over top of it, an arm over top of it, that's going to determine the height of your pile, because it's going to keep cutting it down. And that pile is going to reduce in size and volume, because that's what happens in the composting process. So.
Trying to ask that in a way that wasn't leading, because I'm thinking about the city government here collects leaf litter, and they're running out of space because they're using loaders to just pile it, and there's over an acre of leaf litter, and they're running out of space.
Right, right. And at this time of year, that definitely happens. We're really encouraging as much mulch mowing on lawns as possible. So that's a process. Both grass clippings and leaves really should be going back. If the property that Keith has, if they had continued to mow the grass and just leave it there, mow the hay, leave it there, every year that organic matter would build up and it would become part of the soil, and it would be building that soil. And that's really what we're trying to do. When the trees drop their leaves, they really, the nutrients really need to go back into that tree. So that they can grow further. So we really want that to be on the ground. Now, people have gotten an idea that everything should be green and beautiful and all that kind of stuff, and it will be in general. But when the leaves fall, you might have some mulch on your lawn, and then the winter rains and all that kind of stuff will start breaking those down. The worms will come up in the soil and have food and actually process those leaves and all that. So that's really something that we are working on to a large extent. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Westchester County, New York, but it's very fancy outside of New York City, and it's, they want everything managed. Well, they made a decision with their leaves to ship them across the river. So this is a toll that all the trucks have to pay to ship them across the river to a composting facility. It costs them $1 million plus to do that every year, and they have no organic matter on their lawns. So their lawns are deplete of all the organic matter that's going there, because they're not even keeping it in the community. They're shipping it across a river where it's never going to get back to that side of the river. And they really have problems with erosion control, with all of those things. So we really have to be thinking about composting and organic matter as a very as part of the whole nutrient cycle. I think in Japan there's a thing called clean ground syndrome. And that means that everything is always removed. There's nothing that's not tied down on the ground. And as a result of that, no organic matter. So they don't have that cycling and all that kind of stuff. So having leaves and having compost piles in your yard and all that stuff should be the way it is, not the way, not you know, everything gets moved off and taken to someplace else, because we can't continue. We create dust bowls that way. And that's how the Dust Bowl was created in the Midwest. Long Island has a Dust Bowl. Also had a Dust Bowl period where just everything blew away because we were using agriculture to an extreme, and we weren't keeping our cover crops on our soils. So we're big into keeping those mulches, keeping soil covered all the time, whether it's in green, some sort of crown cover, or mulches and all that kind of stuff. And if you mow those leaves, they really will get small. You can chip leaves, you can mow leaves, and a lot of facilities will chip leaves because it makes them process more quickly. So if you guys ground your leaves, that would help a little bit to get things under control. We went to an extreme because we didn't have, in New York, some people went to an extreme because we could only compost leaves. We couldn't mix them with anything else. So there wasn't enough nitrogen there because we weren't really, food waste is a very new thing, and it's the hardest thing for us to compost. It's the easiest and it's the hardest. And it's the hardest because people put waste in it. It's the easiest because it all breaks down very nicely and becomes part of our soil amendment. So, okay, so let's, so I'm sorry, the end of that story. So what people were doing with leaves, what communities, municipalities were doing with leaves was adding fertilizer. And we talked a little bit about that yesterday, chemical fertilizers. And we really don't want to go to that point because we'd like to get away from the chemical fertilizers. But that was the nitrogen source that they could legally use because of regulation. So we worked on that. Uh-huh.
I guess I may as well ask, thinking about Brian's question about spent grains from distilleries, is that, in your mind, an opportunity, particularly in Kentucky, to deal with that leaf waste?
Tremendous opportunity. It's not considered a special waste, right?
That was my understanding.
Is it?
Unless it goes into a lagoon, if it's direct from the distillery, it is solid waste.
It's just solid waste, so it's not a special waste. So that could be combined with leaves.
Yes.
And that would be a tremendous opportunity. That would be a very good thing to be blending in. And because you have a lot of distilleries and a lot of granaries, that's a good way to do it. In New York, we have, upstate New York, we have a Budweiser brewery. And it had a whole sewage treatment plant that just handled clean food grade material. So everything was clean. It was food or feed grade quality. So all of that was handled in that sewage treatment plant because they make a lot of beer. And they were able to take that material and make a product called NutriBrew. So technically it is a sludge. Technically it's a sludge, but because it was so clean at every ounce of the operation, it was something that could be handled as a clean product, totally clean product, no chemical contaminants, nothing like that. So that was marketed as NutriBrew, and it was a tremendous product. We also made cakes out of that, dried stuff down, made cakes out of that, and used it for cattle feed. And we have some people in New York City that are actually taking some of the microbrew grains, clean, food grade, drying those down, grinding them for flour for breads, and making more of a sourdough type bread. It's very good. And somebody just got the idea, I can keep that food. I don't have to make that garbage. So it depends on how we handle all of our feedstocks. what quality they're going to be and whether they're going to have problems. The only problem with the grains is there is alcohol in them, and that's it's not a problem in general, but it can slow down your microbes. So the alcohol can, but the foods and the sugars and all the other stuff are going to speed up your process. So it really balances out. It's like, I don't know how many people use agricultural lime to balance their pH and all that stuff, or for sanitation on dead animals or whatever. We'll say, okay, just cover it with lime. That'll sanitize it. It only sanitizes what it touches. So it's only the outside of that roadkill deer or cow that's died that it sanitizes. The rest is all, the microbial activity can overcome all of that and work through that and compost. Because we use it in dairy manure, you know, people will put it at the end of their aisles for dairy manure, just for sanitation and, you know, other situations, lots of other situations. And it does kill what it contacts, but everything else can overcome that. So, okay, do we need to stretch or anything like that? We okay to go for a little while longer? Okay. So this is going to be recap from yesterday, and I'll go through the beginning part more quickly. But as we have discussed different feedstocks and different questions, we can slow down or do whatever we want through this. So feel free to ask questions. We talked about, you know, waste and making sure that all of our organics are managed. And so much of our waste stream is organic. And these numbers here do not reflect, this says 60%, but it doesn't reflect human manure or any livestock manure. That's a lot of organics. So none of these numbers that we all use in recycling and composting reflect those things. So that's another whole thing that we have to deal with. But it would take care of the grains, it would take care of all the other stuff that we're really talking about here. So I'm not gonna belabor this, but we just have a lot of work to do. We don't want it to be in the landfill. That's why we're working hard to get food waste out, because it's a methane producer. We just don't want that. So our DECs or EECs or whatever are very much pushing, let's get the food waste out. So I know in New York, we're working hard to say yes most of the time as regulators, and to really promote that whole thing. Yeah, people do mess up. And if you mess up, you're going to have to be under a permit situation in New York or any place else. It's, but if you can do it, like we have 4 acres of compost, we don't have any permit violations or anything, because we have somebody that does take care of it and does manage it. And it only takes about 10 man-hours a week to manage that large site. All of our people, all of our different entities, our barns and all that kind of stuff, bring their manure out to our site. And so that's how it all gets there. And this is just processing, turning, doing the other stuff that it takes that amount of time. I will talk about our site a little bit more later. But feeding people, feeding animals, we want to do all these things before we compost it, and absolutely before we get it into a landfill. I think the Y compost, the only one I'm going to add to Keith's slide is the water holding capacity, which is so, so important. We've talked about all the others already, and we talked about the water holding capacity, but there were a few people that weren't here. It would solve, and it really should be on those NRCS slides. So we're going to want to get that on there, because they know that this is a big issue. It moderates our soil moisture. So if we have compost being used on our farms, we'll have better soil moisture. We'll actually be able to create those communities that we need to process waste. And so I would add that to your slide, and all the others that we have here. We talked about the endless opportunities for composting. This is just stuff that many of us have been asked to manage. you know, from the garlic festival to the gummy vitamins to gel caps to liquid manures. We do all kinds of liquids, and we have processes that can do liquids. We will talk about that as we go. So compost, I think we all have an idea of what composting is. We do have some posters. We have all kinds of stuff on our website. Feel free to download, use. In fact, I'd like to print some posters out before I go. You know, just so, I usually, when I travel, I'll take them to Staples or something like that and print them out so that you guys have them in a central location. And this is a home scale one to mid-scale one. But we also have a whole bunch on compost use and how to do the erosion control, ag use, horticulture use, all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to keep going. Organisms make the world go round. Microbes make the world go round. We wouldn't be eating, we wouldn't be standing here without them. So we just want to harness them and be able to use them in the best way possible. So what we are doing when we're composting is we're creating a habitat, and I want you to put yourself in this mindset all the time. You're creating a clean habitat for microbes to do all the work. You can do all the work. You can turn every single day and burn up a lot of diesel fuel doing that, or you can allow these microorganisms to process the material for you, and they will. You just have to give them the right habitat. You have to give them food, shelter, and moisture. We'll talk more about that. We have, I will show this at some point, maybe lunch, but we have a video that will answer some questions that people had yesterday about how disease suppression works. On this video called Vermicomposting, a Living Soil Amendment. I worked with a graduate student. She wanted to make a video and make it go viral. So she was taking video footage, micro video footage, and so the pictures in there are in that video and talk about the worms, how everything works in there, and how the disease suppression works, and the soil mixes, soil blends, and all that kind of stuff. It's on YouTube. It did go viral, and it's still on YouTube. But we can show that at lunch if people want to put that on. It's only like 7 minutes. We always do short videos so that people get an idea of what's happening. But that's a helpful one. Yep. There we are. Okay. So it's that whole network, it's the whole web of all those organisms, and there are billions in every process. And if we can give them all the things they need, then we're going to be able to move forward. Mushrooms, funguses, all part of the process. People will yell, I got mushrooms growing in my compost. I'm like, good, don't eat them necessarily, but they're all part of the process. They break down that wood that we need to break down so that we can, that the process will actually work, and the other microbes. There's a book called Worms Eat My Garbage, and it's a great book. The author has since passed a long time ago, but it's a really, really simple book. Mary Applehoff was the person, and somebody actually has done some work on making sure that we can keep it out there, because it's just a simple vermicomposting handbook that's worth reading. It's a quick read, but it's called Worms Eat My Garbage. And it really should be called Worms Eat the Microorganisms That Eat My Garbage. Because the worms are actually not eating our stuff. They're eating those microbes. And it makes a very, very rich medium because of the enzymes and all that kind of stuff. And we'll do a worm exercise maybe right before lunch or something like that. Oh, here. We'll do a worm exercise right before lunch. It will feedback on this, so I don't think I can. I'll try to keep my, I'm usually looking both ways. I know it's right here, so I can do that. So they break down the lignin. worms are part of the process, but they come into the process in the very later stages because they can't handle temperatures, high temperatures. If we got to the 130 degrees Fahrenheit that we want our compost to reach, then the worms couldn't live. So they always migrate in later. So, or some people will add worms later, just so that they can live in that compost and they can become part of the soil as well. So I have seen people I've seen kids do it in science fairs, but take 2 pots, put some worms in one pot and no worms in the other pot, and see what you grow in there. Just, have a plant in there and see the differences of what the worm's gut can give us in terms of trace minerals and all that kind of stuff to have a better plant response. And it really does work, and it can be as simple as the science fair experiments. We do it in larger experiments as well. So they're part of another part, and we will talk about vermicomposting. All different feedstocks. We color code our feedstocks. You see our browns and our greens because they're browns and greens or carbon and nitrogen, and people were getting it better when we actually color-coded things. Everything has carbon and nitrogen in it. Don't get me wrong. We have carbon and nitrogen in us, but there's more in, it's pretty much equal parts in manure, food processing waste. Those are fresh green pressings, apple pressings, mash, grape pumice, all those kinds of things. Those are very nitrogenous, and the way we can tell that is they stink more than other things. So if they're sitting around, if grass clippings, fresh grass clippings are sitting around, or if they're bagged and somebody has to open that bag afterwards, we know those are what we call putrescible, and they get really stinky. Not maybe as bad as dead animals, but we can have really bad odor issues. And that's why we work with some of the food processors, either to compost or to feed animals, feed livestock with some of those materials, because they have value still. Pond weeds, seaweeds, lake weeds, biosolids. We call biosolids, the name for sludges is biosolids. They changed that to protect the innocent, I think, or the guilty. It was changed many years ago, but there are lots of different things that are considered sludges, and only human manure pretty much is considered a biosolid. So, but we have paper waste sludges, we have all kinds of things that have all varying degrees of problems and challenges, I should say. Fish and meat, we do a lot of that. About 50%, at least 50% of the work that I do is in composting dead stock. And we'll talk about that tomorrow more than probably today, but you'll hear a little bit about it today. So just a little bit of science, a little bit of the process. We have I know I have a thing there, no. We have our food waste, our food scraps, our organic residuals in the middle there. They need microorganisms, they need oxygen, and they need water. Microbes breathe oxygen, use oxygen just like we do. They have to have oxygen or they will not thrive. So we have the feedstocks or our organic matter. Microorganisms, do we have to add microorganisms to most composts? Huh? It's good to add a scoop of soil. Yep, not too much soil, but a scoop of soil works. We've got enough bacteria on our skin to take us out. We don't really need that. I can grow really good stuff in my refrigerator without trying to do that. I'm not trying to, I'm trying to eat that food. But microbes are ubiquitous. They're everywhere, and they come in, we sneeze on things, we just breathe on things, and we are affecting things, and that's why things go bad in our refrigerator. The leftovers can go bad in our refrigerator if we don't manage things well. So we really don't need to add a lot of I'm not a big, and go ahead and add to this if you want, Dr. Lucas. Do we need to add stuff? It's really all over the place. Occasionally we will inoculate something, but it usually does not need to happen. I was working with the coir producers in the coconut producers in India on some short work that we were doing, and they really wanted to add microbes to the coir and then ship it to the U.S., cube it, ship it to the U.S., and have us use it. And so we did a whole lot of trials for them and stuff like that, but I don't need the microbial activity that's in India. So I really didn't want it, and USDA would tell us, no, we don't want to do that. So I really had a hard time, thinking, even if we do have the microbes that are in that mix there, I don't really want to do that. That's something that we don't want to, yeah.
Well, I have a question, sort of on your last slide.
Microphone.
Or are we holding questions till the end?
No. Do you want you want to give them the microphone? Wake ups, Keith. If we're taping it, that's all. Because I know it'll be an important question.
I don't know how important it is, but you in your last slide you had fish and meat, and I mentioned to you yesterday, Gene, that the old recommendation when I was a graduate student in the 90s was that we don't put meat in our compost, and so I guess my question is two questions. When did that kind of change, that mindset change? Because it does make sense. It's all protein, which is all nitrogen.
Right.
And do we need to do things differently to accommodate putting meat in? Like, for example, at home, I still don't put meat and fish in my now eggshells. Yeah, I'll throw those in, but not meat and
Right.
and I have 2 dogs, and so that might influence
And they
why
would
I
very
don't.
much like it. Yes. Yeah, no, that, it hasn't changed. It has changed over time, but not for backyard composting, not for community composting, where we have a 3-bin system at a community garden or something like that. There we really don't want to put a lot of milk and meat in it. And that has to do with size. It's the mass that we're composting. We have to have the proper mass to get heat. And in order to do meat, milk, and fish, we have to have that heat. So it's sort of a guarantee issue for not putting it in your home scale compost, because I consider that still cold compost most of the time. We have done studies, we've looked at the microbes in that, and actually in 9 months we get really good drawdown of the microbes in a compost pile that doesn't get hot. But it takes that long, that part of the cycle, to do that. So when when a community is ready to do food waste, there's no way to tell the cafeteria to pull that half a hot dog out of there, or the scraps of turkey, or whatever. It's just not going to happen. But because we're doing that in large scale, in windrows, we can control all of that, and we can keep animals, predators, vectors from coming into the piles. And not with fences, with heat, with the heat from the composting process, we can do that. And we have more of a guarantee that way. When we do mortality composting, when I put a whole cow in a pile, and we do, we can, if we don't get temperature in that pile in 12 to 24 hours, something's going to come in there and pull that cow out and start munching on it. A coyote or a coon or whatever will jump in there and be gnawing on things. We don't want that to happen. So within 12 hours, I can generally heat up a compost pile at any time of the year in New York, and we keep things going. If we have frozen animals, we will still envelop those in municipal wood chips. So in carbon, and I really mean the chunky wood chips, we'll make an envelope, 24-inch envelope around those all those animals, and let it go. Because they'll stay frozen until our external temperatures, our ambient temperature, starts coming up. And we've had situations where DOT's just piled up frozen deer in a parking lot, and, you know, they thaw, and I was like, call me when they're frozen, but I'm not coming out when they're thawed. You deal with it then. Not my problem. So, and we really don't want all that flesh waste and don't allow all that flesh waste to go into a lot of our landfills. You have a big deal with horses, so we will talk more about horses and why or why not. Why is it better for a horse to go into a landfill than to go into a compost pile? That's something to ponder, you know, for the owner. Yeah, right.
And they're euthanized.
Right. So have done a lot of work on euthanasia drugs in composting. So we do have the answers for that as well. So that will be tomorrow, though. I don't think we're going to get to that part today. So our products. So we have our inputs, our feedstocks, and our products. Compost, humus, whatever you want to call it. Carbon dioxide. What uses carbon dioxide? Think about it as a system. Plants. We grow plants with carbon dioxide. Greenhouses will use carbon dioxide cartridges for plants to be able to get more, to grow better, to have their requirements met, stuff like that. So we've taken compost operations and hooked them into greenhouses so that the carbon CO2 can go into, be vented into the greenhouse so that it helps with plant production. So we've done some of that on very limited basis, but we've done a little bit of that. Water, moisture's coming off that compost process all the time.
The carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide, is that why you mentioned about putting trees maybe in the area where you're doing composting?
Absolutely, that's part of it, but I wouldn't necessarily, when we look at site layout and stuff like that, I like to have trees as to keep the neighbors' eyes off of things, to keep the passing cars' eyes off of things. Because if they see me hanging a pig over a pile and I'm putting that in, they're really going to get anxious. So we encourage all of our facilities to have a tree line just to protect themselves, really. And it also acts as a biofilter, so that you have less odor issues. It controls the wind a little bit. It does a lot of things for you. So usually we will use an evergreen type of tree to line the properties. It also defines your windrows. I get 200 inches of snow, so I have one just as a snow fence. I've got 4 lines of trees that go back 10 acres, and they really do work. It's amazing because I don't have so much drifting in my field when I'm skiing, you know, that kind of thing. So, heat. Heat is a byproduct, of course. We've got 130 to 150, 60, 70, 80 degrees in a compost pile. We can train that heat, and we've got a system that does work. I have a picture of what, so when we get into the other technologies, I'll go through that one because I have a bunch of pictures of it. But it actually takes the heat, sucks the heat through the pile, and that either heats hot water or goes into microbar exchangers and generates electricity. So we're actually capturing that heat to do something. We've done it with greenhouses as well. Put the heat into greenhouses for winter applications, and we have some systems that can do that as well. Nitrogen, green. If we have a pile of nitrogen and we just keep putting our food in a pile, we're going to have ammonia emissions. Stuff's just going to go up because we don't have any carbon to buffer that. We really want that carbon to be able to be there to buffer that up. I want the nitrogen to be in my product. I don't want it to go into the atmosphere because I'm selfish. I want the plant nutrients for my plants. So we want to do that. So we'll also have slow decomposition and odor. We talked a little bit about the pile of sticks yesterday. If I start with a pile of sticks, I stack up all my sticks, and I come back in a year, what am I going to have? Who knows? Pile of sticks. There's no nitrogen. There's no green materials. There's no other stuff to help those things break down. If I chip that wood, it'll do better, and it'll give me a little bit of heat. It just will be slower. And it'll process that material slower because the material's harder to process. So we want to make sure that we balance the carbon to nitrogen ratios. These are C to N ratios, and they tend to be quite confusing for people in general, and even for my own head, the way my own head works. So I don't talk about them quite in this way, but I just want you to see we're looking for a 30-to-1 carbon to nitrogen. And our horse manure is perfect when it comes out of the horse. After we had a lot of bedding, then it's off. The carbon to nitrogen ratio is off a little bit. But the horse people really have no excuse for not composting their manures. Even if they're going to compost them and they're contaminated, you know, if they do have drugs and stuff like that in them, they can be used for daily cover in the landfill if they needed to be. I am sure that they would not need to be, just because I've done enough testing of horse manure and stuff like that. I do avoid tracks. I do avoid, you know, racetracks and stuff like that, because I just feel the potential for abuse is greater there. Cow manure, not so much, and that's really, a lot of cow manure is liquid, is very liquidy manure, so that takes a lot more carbon to work. And our compost, our actual compost, is about a 10-to-1 when it's a finished compost. That means it doesn't have a lot of carbon in it. Carbon, I want to show you. So yeah, in fruit waste we have some carbon. That's the seeds, that's some of the other stuff. But you know, an apple doesn't have a lot of carbon in it. Wood. All these guys, I've got to walk away for a second. All these guys here are all woody wastes, right? And look at the variation in carbon to nitrogen ratio. A log, 700-to-1. That's because there's no surface area. It's all one thing and only can attack the outside. Sawdust isn't a lot better because it's so dense and no air can go through the sawdust. So it's more dense. There's not a lot of airspace. So it doesn't work as well as a compost amendment. We would think it would break down faster, but there's a lot of surface area, and those lignin digesters need to work on all those sides anyway. So we can have, like Cornell's compost is too high in carbon. Where our waste is too high in carbon, except where we're adding food, a lot of the cafeteria wastes. And that's because we have mostly animal manure. We have a lot of animals at our vet school. We have a huge vet school, and there's a lot. And we have polo horses and a lot of others around campus. So too much carbon. So we're always looking to add more liquid manures and stuff like that. Paper, bark. So bark and wood chips are right around the same. So they're 100 to 130 to 1. And that's what we're really looking for. That allows air to flow through piles. It allows things to work. And we don't use it in all processes, but we use it where we don't want to do very much turning. So if I want the compost to work by itself and I don't have to do the labor, I want a little bit coarser material. In our home scale, not bark or chips. I would use more like leaves. I'd prefer to use leaves because then I don't have to screen it out. But that's how we're balancing some of these. So the way it works, instead of the 30 to 1 and all that kind of stuff, is, oops, I'll stay over here. We need 3 buckets of carbon, and that's 2 to 3 because everything is not the same all the time. So 2 to 3 buckets of carbon, and you can see those are 5-gallon buckets, but it could be a cottage cheese container or it could be a 6-yard bucket on a loader. Okay, So 2 to 3 of those to 1 of the nitrogen waste. So that dense manure that we put in the container yesterday, really dense manure. That is going to be nitrogen, but we covered it with a whole lot of carbon. We put carbon all around that so that they'll be able to work together better. And we'll have a compost. We'll actually get some compost in there, and that will help that. Yes. We used this type of container yesterday. Just a wire bin that we make sure we put plenty of carbon in the bottom. So we have a whole carbon biofilter in the bottom. In this case, because we were indoors, we just put leaves in it. And we're just doing food waste there. So we're going to add leaves, cover them with food waste. We never, ever, ever should see any of our waste products, any of our food waste products. We should see the carbon on the outside, but we really shouldn't see any food sticking out of a pile at any point, or any dead animals sticking out of a pile at any point. That's not something that we want. Those are both attractants and would bring something in, and if we just put that biofilter over them, it doesn't just cover them, but it covers their odor as well. And I work with high-path avian influenza, where we have tremendous amounts of odor because we have millions of dead birds and dead eggs that have to be taken care of and all that kind of stuff. And as soon as we get everything into piles, we lose all the odor. But before that, it's almost, you're doing the Vicks vapor rub in your nose and anything else that you can keep that odor out, because it gets to you after a while. So, and once we envelop those guys in wood chips, and we do use a chunky wood chip with all of that composting, because we can have, with 3.2 million birds and eggs, we had 100 acres of windrows on one of those outbreaks. So, covering with carbon. All carbon is not equal. We just saw those slides with the carbon to nitrogen ratio. It's all different. It all has different properties. I'm not fond of sawdust almost ever. And if somebody offers you sawdust and has big piles of sawdust, just make sure, and you do want to use it, and there's ways to use it, but make sure it's not from pressure-treated lumber. Even our newer pressure-treated lumbers are still going to have something that's keeping those pests out of our lumber. So it just hasn't caught up with us yet, but it might not be lead and arsenic, but it's probably cadmium and other things. Something has to work. Yeah.
On that note, if you do accidentally use pressure-treated lumber.
Yeah.
If you do actually use pressure-treated lumber, it'll inhibit your microorganisms, but if you're certified organic, it will.
You're sunk.
And you put it on your fields are no longer certified organic for 3 years.
Exactly. And probably longer than 3 years, don't you think?
Well, the rule says 3 years.
Okay.
So and I don't believe there's a testing requirement, but it would be a prohibited substance in your soil.
Right.
And by the rule, that's 3 years.
Right. I'll tell you a story that just will illustrate this point. I looked at one of those pressure-treated lumber playgrounds. We had one at our school that was 22 years old, 23 years old, something like that, needed to be replaced. So I said, okay, we're going to replace this. We want to replace it, but we want to see where those metals from all of the pressure-treated lumber that was used, telephone poles, all that kind of stuff. We want to see if that's still in the medium that the kids are running around on. Sometimes in bare feet when they're not in school, when it's release time. So where did that lead, cadmium, arsenic go? How far did it move? So I brought in, it was my boss at the time, but I brought him up because he looks at metals and soil and all that kind of stuff. And we looked and we did some tests, and where we found the elevated metals was under those walkways, you know, the things that bounce you across. So those, and in the upright posts, so around those, so anything that was touching the ground there. And you know how far it moved in the soil in 22, 23 years? 12 inches. That's all we had to take out around the posts so that our kids weren't going to be contaminated with those metals. So, because I was, okay, do we have to take all that medium out that's under that, catches you when you fall off the swings or whatever? Do we have to take all of that out or not? And we were able to just selectively take stuff out and tested the rest. So, and put in a metal playground this time, So that's how metals move, not very far, not very fast. So they do concentrate in our, yeah.
Moles in my field, especially around where I grow. Is composting a good avenue for managing moles?
For managing moles, not necessarily. Not necessarily. Good soil to dig through and all that kind of stuff. So compost won't necessarily manage moles. Yeah, compost use won't necessarily do that. In fact, it could actually add to it because worms will come in, you'll have healthy soils, and the moles might come in to prey on the worms. So that's probably not going to do that for you. We got to have healthy systems, healthy lawns. I have a lot of toads on my property. And, after it rains, they're all over the place, and I feel very happy about that because I have living, thriving frogs and toads. And, if I had a contaminated lawn, if I was using a lot of heavy metal products on it, I would not have that.
On the topic of what we can and can't include or shouldn't include.
On the topic of
What you should or shouldn't include with certain compost. Compostable dishware, is that a similar issue with heat like meat?
It's a good question. Compostable dishware, I don't believe in it. That's personally because you're always going to have some plastic there. If you're certifying organic, you can have less than 0.5% of any cutlery in it. Plates, cutlery, cups. So that's nothing. So you can't certify organic if you're taking in food waste or taking in any cutlery, any of the degradables. It's just simply putting more plastic into our soils because there is plastic there. There's also potato starch and cornstarch and all that kind of stuff. But if you're going to promote something, I would be promoting bamboo cutlery, paper, truly paper plates, not paper with all the finishes and all that kind of stuff, the PFAS and all that on it, which is the PFAS are the forever chemicals. And we're really, I don't know how much you're struggling with PFAS right now as regulators, but we're looking at it in a big way, and it's in all over the country, all of our wastewater treatment plants. So that's where it's landing, it's in, and as a result, it ends up in our water supplies as well. So our municipal water supplies will have it in because there are 15,000 chemicals that are in the suite of forever chemicals, is what they call them. They just don't break down easily, and we don't know when they will break down. But those are in our wastewater and our water and our waste solids, biosolids. So we're really looking at that as an industry right now, as how do we clean it up? And our best way really is to be banning the PFAS substances. That's the only way we're going to be able to get that out of everywhere. But if we're using it and distributing it, especially the biosolids, there's a situation in Maine, the state of Maine, where a farm was taking a lot of biosolids in, and Maine is pretty rural, so it's not like big industry or anything like that. They were taking in biosolids, spreading the biosolids on their land, And their land was 2 years ago, all the animals on the land, the water, everything about it has been condemned. And they can't live on it. They put some solar panels out there because that's the only thing that can actually be there. So cows, they couldn't, slaughter the cows. They couldn't do any of that. They had to compost everything, basically. And it's there, but at least it doesn't leave that farm. So biosolids use is a big deal. Spreading biosolids on land is a big deal. And we have a whole program on that called A Case for Caution and what we don't know about it. And these forever chemicals are just emerging in the last couple of years. Just the fact that we have high levels of them in all of these places. So I'm sure you guys will be getting on that soon as well. Just looking at the PFAS situation. I know New York was really slow, and we don't know, none of us know what to do about it. So it's like, okay, but we've got to deal with that challenge. Yes?
As an anecdote for Kentucky, I have some friends that work in the Division of Water, and they're actively testing in all the watersheds throughout the state. And as I understand it, the Division of Water, much like everyone else, has no idea what permissible limits are or not, but they're finding it everywhere. So
yeah, I don't think we're going to find it in the food waste compost. I'm doing some testing now with that. We actually just started up a lab in Syracuse, Environmental Science and Forestry. The SUNY Environmental Science and Forestry has a lab to look at PFAS, and we can look at them commercially, but they told me I had a 6-month wait in line if I was going to be wanted my sample results back. So I was like, we have to get a handle on this. We need to know more faster. So thank you for that addition. Did you have your hand up in the cat? Okay.
Excuse me, thank you. So we had a situation over in Henry County where there was some, I'll call it food waste, but there was a larger company over in the next county producing jams and jellies and that sort of thing, right? Mm-hmm. And their waste was, they had to pay somebody to haul it off, and they were spreading it on farms, mm-hmm. and basically saying, oh, this is not harmful at all, it's sugar water. Mm-hmm. Of course, they hadn't composted it or anything, and there were all kinds of problems like that. Mm-hmm. With that, rather the spreading of that liquid untreated or non-composted. Should that have, or could that have been composted to relieve some of the issues? So there was, when it got in the water streams, the dissolved oxygen kind of deal. The dissolved oxygen would be used up to convert that mm-hmm. sugar water, right, mm-hmm. and kill all the fish.
Yeah,
because there was no oxygen. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, runoff is a big deal for all of that. We and we may still do it down here, but we used to land apply butcher waste, a certain amount of butcher waste. If people were butchering on their farms, they could distribute it, blood, and that's really high nutrient material. Like the sugar water is probably a lot more minor, a lot less of a problem. But the runoff from all of that stuff can be a problem. And sometimes when we have a heavy rain, we have overland flow. And sometimes it simply sinks into the ground and maybe it makes it to the water table. But it's more that those overland flow opportunities that we seem to be getting a lot of that are putting a lot of nutrients into the water. The other really big one that we really deal with a lot is, and that's a big nutrient, is fertilizer. And we know whether it's manure as fertilizer or other things, if it's running overland and into a stream or anything like that, it will cause major fish kills. We'll have real problems with it. So it is a fact of nutrients moving to the water.
Composting that sugar water, would composting that sugar water help with that issue?
Absolutely. And when we use, so I'll get to this in erosion control, but we'll talk about it a little bit. When we use compost, when we use that as a mulch or whatever, we can use compost blankets, we can put it on surfaces. And we put it over the soil. And what happens when it rains is that soil drips on, the rain comes down, soaks into the compost, okay, and that becomes a sponge, and that just keeps taking in that moisture when we lay it out in a sheet. When the rain hits the soil, it hits the soil and it makes mud, and it starts immediately running. So if it can stay on top, the rain is going to stay on top. If we put that layer, that blanket down, and it rains, we'll be able to keep our slopes in really good shape. I'll show you when we get to erosion control, because I have a lot of really good slides on that, where Texas couldn't grow anything on its roadsides, and their aquifer was in such trouble that they really needed to do something. So they actually used put blankets of biosolids compost on their roadsides, and they seeded this down, and it worked fine. It worked great. And we're not using it year after year after year. We're putting on a blanket at this point. So that worked really well, and they've had vegetation on their roadsides all the way through. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. I don't know if I can get there. It's way far into this one. I'd have to figure out how to get there. But yeah, we don't want runoff. We don't want that bare soil. We want compost or mulches or something on top of our soils so that they don't take off and get into the water and cause those biological oxygen bands. So composting the sugar water would be perfect. It's the sugar water and the pressings. There are skins and other things, seeds that are taken out. All of that can go right into a compost process, and actually is good. It's a good nitrogen source. So take that into your facilities if you can use it. It also helps to water your piles. It helps to, actually, we're talking about that right now, but it helps us to balance some of the moisture. A lot of times we think of compost as being pretty sloppy. But if we can balance the carbon and nitrogen and the moisture, it won't be so sloppy. So we have a very, very simple test called a squeeze test. That some people are calling it the meatball test also, where if we pick up a handful of medium, the medium that we're composting, and we squeeze it in our hand, we open up our hand, or we squeeze it in our hand, and if we have water dripping down the sides of our hand, through between our fingers, we have too much water, too much moisture in there. If we open up our hands and it's in a nice little meatball, a nice little ball, we're perfect. If we open up our hands and it blows away, we need more moisture, okay? So that's what we're looking at, and we actually do have cover blowing off of piles when it's too light, when the carbon is too light. You'll just open up a pile, especially the mortality stuff. So it's kind of interesting. So squeeze test, really simple. We also use a thermometer. We had it out yesterday. We use 18, 36, or 48-inch thermometers, depending on the size of our operations. That's the other thing that we use to monitor piles. And I can tell what's going on in that pile all the time. I can deduce what's happening if I have moisture in it, if I know what the temperature is. If it's really, really a dry situation, I've built my pile, I put food waste in it, I put leaves in it, but it's still dried out, my temperatures can go down, because there's not enough moisture in there. So I might have to figure out a way to get more moisture in there. Sometimes I was working in New Mexico, and I was like, start with everything wet. Because in arid climates, And down here, we can have that situation. We want everything to be moist when it goes into the pile. I don't want to have a pile of hay, of grass clippings over there, and then they dry out. Then I put them in the pile. No, I want to put those grass clippings in and capture that right away. So I capture that moisture right away. So keeping moisture in a pile is really important, because when we get to 130, 140, 150 degrees, steam is coming off of that pile all the time, and it's almost impossible to re-wet a pile. So you can put soaker hoses down it, you can do all kinds of stuff, but if we're not it's really hard to incorporate water unless we make ditches in there and fill those ditches with really moist material. It just is really hard to re-wet a pile. So always start a little bit on the wet side, especially if you're in an area that's very dry or going through dry conditions. Turning compost. So we, just different bins, and this is probably in my bin area also, but I don't tend to turn compost very much, but the ways that we do turn compost are by using a pitchfork or something like that to turn compost. And that's just to get air into that pile. That's all we're trying to do. We also use rotating drums, and we can get air into those rotating drums. The only thing with a rotating drum, if anyone's ever used a rotating drum, we have to use a full batch. We can't just put a little in this day and a little in tomorrow, a little in tomorrow. They've got to be run as batches. So you have to have multiple rotating drums or juice barrels to do that with if you want to do batch systems. One of the things that those rotating drums do, they look very cool and all that kind of stuff, great, but it's off the ground. Then we're going to give it a little turn, and it's going to go thump, because I only have a little bit of, an orange and an apple in there, and thump, and it's not going to do very much. It's also off the ground, so it's colder there, especially in winter situations, and we have them freeze. So we really have to run them as batches so that they have heat in them and they can actually run. And I've run all sizes of those the rotating drums, and they're harder to manage than other things, except when you do it like this. And I was doing this, so I was working with some kids to make compost young people to make compost in Haiti. And this was one of the methods that we were using, because they did have a safe track that they could work on, and it was a compound that was indoors. It was a children's community center. So it was a little bit protected. They were growing plants, they were doing other stuff, and they wanted to learn to make compost. So I went down with an NGO, sent me down, and we learned to make compost in different ways, but that was one of the ways that really did work well. Sorry.
Hi, ma'am. I was going to ask, I could see this is a closed system. Have you ever thought it could also be used for biogas?
It's not actually an enclosed system. So if I were doing human manure that way, I would leave it in an enclosed system in a black barrel so that I would sanitize it. So if I had a toilet, a composting toilet, a pit toilet or something like that, had it in a black barrel, I'd close that barrel up, I'd just stick it in the sun and leave it. And that would sanitize that, because the heat of the sun on the black barrel would take care of that. I lost my train of thought here. So with this, these have holes in them. So we drill holes into these so that we don't have too much moisture in these and we can get temperature. So these have little pinholes in them so that we just get a little bit of air in there. Okay, so they're not a contained system. They're not a biodigester. If I were looking at, we actually take some of those water carboys and make digesters out of some of those, and we can take some methane off. That's a possibility, a situation like that would be a possibility of getting stuff off. And we actually have 22 farms that are not run by cow power, but they produce cow power. So the manure goes into a digester, and it's anaerobic. It's not aerobic. These are aerobic systems. We let air in, but the anaerobic systems can give off methane, and we can use that to generate electricity and to do other things. There are some sophisticated systems that will do that. So digesters are kind of an interesting thing. I work a little bit with digesters, but and a lot of our biosolids, a lot of the human waste is processed in digesters as well. Just not, I don't do it on a very small scale.
In terms of turning, we talked a little bit yesterday about turning compost and, of course, turning here. What if you got, 100 foot or whatever on a farm, compost pile? What about turning that? I know they make machines, pretty expensive. You got to do a lot of stuff to justify those. But say I have a 100 foot and I'm composting some manure, a cow, some leaves or whatever kind of thing. How often do I need to turn that? Do I need to turn it? Do I lay a base of carbon down and not turn it? Can you address that?
I'm gonna do that as I go through the next bunch of slides, okay? Because I'll show you some equipment and some of that. We do have different pieces of equipment, and I do have an equipment slide. We have straddle turners. We've got all kinds of loaders. And if you're a farm, it's better to have a loader to turn your compost than to have a windrow turner, unless you get really big. If you get really big, if you're acres, then you probably want a windrow turner. And we use a windrow turner periodically on 4 acres. But we don't use it a lot. It's used amazingly little on our process. And we do turn our compost piles. So there's all different equipment that I will get to shortly. So different systems, multi-bin systems, and we go from small to large in this part of our section. We can use cement. We can use cinder blocks. I don't like either of them that much. So if you're looking at a facility, I don't like cement at all. I don't like asphalt. I would prefer to have a cloth and gravel pad down, which is certified by NRCS. It's a standard that they have, and they've agreed that this is a good way to deal with it. Municipalities generally still are done on hard surfaces. But if you have a farm, you want to keep that in good condition. The reason you're composting is to improve your soil. So you don't want to put cement down. You don't want to put asphalt down. That just continues to pollute it. I don't like cement as walls because they rob oxygen and they keep those sides cold. It doesn't matter how hot your climate is, you always will have cool sides. And the microorganisms that you don't want, the pathogenic organisms that you don't want in your compost, can colonize on those walls, and it's just, then you're always going to have a bit of a contamination issue.
Jean, in reference to the concrete or cement in creating bins.
In what?
Creating bins.
Yeah.
Is that the same thing you're referencing? You would not.
I wouldn't use
prefer?
I wouldn't use it. I wouldn't use it. Anybody know what the biosphere is? Do you remember what the biosphere is? It was a bubble that they built in Arizona, and they had all different climates in that bubble, right? You want to tell the story? Do you know it? And they put people in there. They put researchers and people just to do different things in different climates and different. They had the taiga, the tundra, everything was in there. Was represented. The tropics were in there. We had oceans in there. Everything was built with cement. Okay, all the infrastructure was cement. And then soil was put in or whatever they needed, but everything was cement, and then it had a bubble top. All of a sudden, the researchers, and this can happen anyway, even if they're not in a bubble, but they started fighting a lot. And there was a lot of arguments and a lot of problems. And what they found out was happening in the end was what happens when concrete cures is it sucks oxygen. So the oxygen was going to the concrete, and people were short on oxygen. So they were getting kind of feisty because they were crossed, they were arguing. And that was the reason. So they had to put a different type of ventilation system in there and air handling system in that bubble to keep people safe. It was, it was supposed to be the globe. It was representing our globe. Yeah.
Just quick point of clarification, cured or curing
Curing concrete.
Okay, but once it's cured and set.
It takes years.
Oh, really?
They say it takes
Okay.
years for that to actually happen. And when it's wet, like in the ocean and a salty ocean, then it has other interactions. So yeah, I wouldn't use a lot of cement around my facilities.
I only ask, you often see sites that have the bays and they're built
I
with
know.
the highway dividers.
Yep. And we use a
which-
lot, and I even promote some of that, depending on what you're doing, but it does keep your sides cool. Especially if it's a reused, not a virgin pour. If you're pouring concrete to do this,
Yeah.
forget about it. Those concrete blocks, the highway dividers, those can really organize things, and those aren't too bad, but you usually will have a soil surface underneath, and you just have those on the sides. And you're not gonna scrape your sides. You can still do it that way.
Okay, thank you. One
Yeah.
good thing.
I'll
that-
show you,
Oh,
I don't know where we are.
Those huge concrete barriers.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of all of our biosolids are done in those type of systems. And they're automatic, they have automatic turners that go up and down the rows and stuff like that. So it's taken care of, but biosolids also has, maybe you have cleaner biosolids down here, but they also have a lot of regrowth issues, and we can't always pass our EPA 503 quality of biosolids compost because we have problems with the pathogens in those. And we only look for 2 pathogens, fecal coliform and salmonella, right? Do you guys look for anything more than that? You just use 503s, and you probably have some stricter ones, right, for Kentucky?
As far as pathogens.
Sorry.
New
New York
as far
made
as
ours-
pathogens, no. I
Yeah.
mean, we have some differences in our regulation right now. We don't really have very many people composting biosolids. Most
Really?
of our
Okay.
biosolids are land farmed instead.
They're what?
Land applied,
They are.
yes,
Farm applied?
yes. Mhm.
Yeah. I would keep in mind that.
Okay.
Okay.
Can I ask you a question, Robin, about that? I've recently heard about a company in Shelby County that is processing biosolids into pelletized fertilizers or something like that.
Can you repeat his question?
So your question is there a facility in Shelby County that's processing biosolids into pelletized fertilizer? I am not aware of that. That is a possibility. Well, that wouldn't be in Shelby County, that'd be in Jefferson County. Yeah.
What is it called?
Louisville Green, they dry through heat
Yep.
dryers, the biosolids down into small pellets that they sell market as Louisville Green as fertilizer.
Okay. And they're using it on lawn, on turf more, or?
I'm not entirely sure what their market constitutes, but I would imagine they distribute it for lawn use and farm use.
Right.
Mhm.
Okay.
That doesn't fall under solid waste.
The permitting process for that is a little bit different. If you'd like to know more about pelletized biosolids, I could go into that, but I believe they're the only municipality right now that's generating a pelletized biosolids product that I know of. Yep.
Okay. So, off on that. So biosolids We all have different regulations. EPA has a set of regulations that are supposed to protect us. One of the issues with that, and I talked about the playground and having that a one-time application, one of the problems with biosolids is we can keep applying biosolids. So if we keep applying those biosolids, then those heavy metals will concentrate and will stay in the top layers of the soil, and then can be available to plants and things like that. So I'm not judging, I'm just saying that. And we have, our rules are not as good as a lot. Our DEC has made stricter rules than EPA. So EPA says, okay, that we want it to be at this standard. And then the state can say, I want it to be stricter to protect my people. And then the county can say, I'd like it to be even stricter. They can't make it less strict, but they can make it more strict than their parent agency, whatever it is, federal, state, or local. Okay, so that makes sense. I think that's true in every state, right? Yeah, there's home rule, but there's only so much home rule. You can't cause problems. When you home rule and you cause a problem, then you're going to get had. Okay, so 3-bin systems, I really like these type of 3-bin systems. We set one up yesterday. That's a 2-bin system at this point. But I like 3 bins, and I like compost in 3s, and my grandmother taught me this many, many moons ago. We compost in 3s because we have an active, we have a curing, and we have a pile that's ready to use. So we always compost in 3s, okay? And so if you're thinking about your whole, you have acres of windrows, that's what you're going to be doing. You're going to be keeping track of where your newest material, your oldest material is, so that you know what's ready to use. And with a facility that has 10 windrows or 20 windrows, you're going to keep track of what's where. And like on our site, and ours is fairly diverse, so I'll talk about it a little bit more. The way we organize things is all our food waste and animal manure goes on this side. Then we've got some mulches that are over here. We have some organic compost being made for the organic farm to use. So we sort of separate ours out in different ways because we have different end uses that we want it for. So the 3-bin systems are great. The kids have been really good at doing the separation in the cafeterias. We make it their job. Their job not to compost, but to make sure that things are sort of separated properly. The janitor or whoever it is, sanitary engineer, whatever we're calling them these days, they're the ones that still have to get it out to the compost piles. Some schools use it as training, so the kids are doing it so that our next generation will be more used to doing what is right with all their might, is what we usually say. We just need to manage all of our waste products better. They all just don't go away. There is no away. We have plans for these bins, and we design these so that they fit the bucket that the company or school or whatever owns. So if you have a 4 foot wide bucket, you want to make sure that you can fit. You don't want to make 3 by 3 by 3 bins. If you have, a 6 foot wide bucket, you want to make sure that you've got a 6 foot space that it can fit into and actually do the work for you. And schools have, well, where we live, schools have snow clearing equipment, so they have a bucket for that, so we usually base it on that. And schools sometimes have a small bobcat or something like that to be able to do it. And bobcats are great for this kind of stuff. The small, bobcat type equipment for turning. But we really just layer things up. We fill the first one up, and then we turn it when it's totally full, let it sit for a while, and then it goes into the next. It gets turned into the next bin. That's its first turn. By the time it gets to the third turn, it's pretty much finished compost. And that'll take some time and filling those, but we use them for, You know, we have, our smallest ones are like 300 kids, and they don't produce enough waste to, to really fill them up as well. But
Gene, I know that with the organic certification for composting, they have a certain standard for turning. In this particular case, what would determine when to turn? Would you use temperature?
For turning windrows?
No, in this setting.
For this, I'm going to regulate it by, I'm going to do the turning by when I fill the first one up. Because it will start heating up. It'll start working, and then that first thing will be a turn. And that's the way to keep it organized. We do it with poultry manure in a lot of places, other manures that are more difficult to manage. So we'll stockpile it in these type of systems, and or mortality. Poultry mortality gets done in these bin type systems periodically. And those don't go from one to the next to the next. Those we just layer in and let them work all the way through. It takes about 2 weeks to process a bird, just a laying hen or a small meat bird. The turkeys take about a month. They're a little bit long, you know, especially large turkeys take a little bit longer to process in something like this. But they're going to go in about 2 weeks. You won't really be able to find a lot of meat or anything like that. So that's what we do with our large outbreaks.
Yeah, so I'm thinking too, after doing this for a while, you will develop a rhythm, and you'll kind of get a sense when to, when not to, how much to put in and how little to put in, and so on and so forth.
You always want to make sure that you have layers, just layers, and you don't want to go all the way out to the edge, because then you'll have leachate coming out of that watermelon that ran up against the wall, you know. So we want to have like a bowl, and I'll show you, I have another good picture. I'll show you the picture of how we lay it in a minute. But there's the plans, they're on our website. It'll be in a couple, so wait 1 second. This is one, these are called hot boxes, is the manufacturer, or the people that design them call them. They'll put perforated PVC pipe in some. I think there's another, no, I don't have that picture. Hold on. One of the problems with it is usually people want to put a lot of perforated PVC pipes in, and that's only maybe a 4x4x4 bin, and they're forcing too much air in it. So they actually have to put caps on the PVC pipe. So one pipe probably that can be capped and uncapped probably would work just fine, because the process naturally happens. Air circulation naturally happens if we have things laid out right. So what happens is when I have a dead animal, I'm going to use a dead cow again, or I'll use a dead horse because we're in Kentucky. So I'll have a dead horse. I'll lay that on a 24-inch bed of wood chips. I'm going to lay my horse down, and if I can euthanize it right on that bed, I'm going to euthanize it right on that bed and tip it. And that's what we usually do with research ones. So we just tip it right over onto that bed. That horse, so the horse is laying there. Loader comes, puts 24 inches of carbon over top of it. In 12 to 24 hours, it starts heating up. We have a digester right here. This thing right here on our bellies. It's digesting all the time. So it is starting to work, and those microbes are in the belly, they're working. The skin breaks. We encourage people to put a break in the skin because it's a little bit easier for the microbes. But they start all mixing together in the first couple days. All the microbes are starting to work and mix together. So they're giving off heat. That heat rises. And the reason that I have all that chunky carbon on the bottom is that heat rises and it wants to bring in air from the bottom. So if I put dense manure on the bottom, then nothing's going to happen. And it's not going to aerate itself. I rarely turn mortality piles. I rarely turn them. So there are reasons why we do that. But most of it is done with a total statically aerated pile. So no forced air, no pipes, nothing else. The heat rises and it wants to circulate around that pile. And I do have a slide of that when we get there. So most of the time, we put too much air into these small boxes anyway, so I don't add a lot for the small boxes, but for larger stuff, I'll show you that. Old foundations, we're just reusing this, and they actually have the leachate coming, or the leachate coming into the bucket over on the side here. And this is an ag experiment station in the tropics, obviously, so sorry, we're not there, it's cold here. But they can take their leachate and they can actually water with the leachate. They can either put it back into their pile and keep that moving, keep the water circulating, or they can water plants with it. It's on St. Lucia, I think this one is. Windrow composting. So we get a little bit bigger. This is all food waste composting, pretty much. A lot of wood waste, so they bring in all the pallets, and or solid waste will bring in clean wood. So they allow clean wood to come in once a year. They will bring the grinder in, bring a tub grinder in or another grinder in, and rent that for the week, because it's really expensive to maintain that equipment, to keep it going. So we encourage people to rent when it makes sense, or to use communal equipment, because you can simply share with your neighbors if they're willing and you're able to do that. Or NRCS, also soil and water, actually I think soil and water tends to have these, might have chippers and hydroseeders and things like that that can be shared out. And with them, it's, a lot of times it is farm need. They'll work with the farmers to get things. If they need something seeded, they'll go in and do it. They do a lot of it for roadside stuff to keep the erosion under control. So a lot of times, but all different parts of the country will have different types of equipment. Some will have it, some won't. We had plastic balers for the bale wrap and all that kind of stuff at one point with our NRCSs. But that's a totally different topic that I don't want to talk, that I'm not going to talk about other than that. Anyway, renting. Bringing that in, screeners, same way. When you have a large operation, you're going to screen for a week each year. And everybody has to do it at the same time pretty much, because sometimes you get too wet material, your material's too wet to screen, and you can't screen it if you need to screen it. So I encourage people to get some of those rotating drums, satellite screens, that kind of stuff, and just rent them for a week or two. Because that's like $3,000 and somebody else maintains it versus you needing to buy the equipment and keep it up and all that kind of stuff. That's a lot. So share, rent, do that kind of stuff. For the huge disease outbreaks that we have, we rent almost all of the equipment from equipment rental people. So we go into an area where we don't live and figure out who has what. And a lot of times it all gets rented from the equipment rental people. So it's an interesting way to be able to function. We don't want to do that for all the time for our farms, but for big operations it can be helpful. This is Cayuga Compost. It is right in Ithaca. And it is food waste composting. They've actually, just let me back up one. They've actually built a hoop. We call them salt sheds. What do we call them down here? But sheds that these big coverall buildings. I don't know what brands we have down here and stuff like that, but big buildings that have plastic tops and usually cement sides and stuff like that. We compost in those. We also will store our finished compost in those places so that we can screen and bag and do all that. So operation-wise, and when you get big enough to do this, having some kind of a shed to keep your compost dry so it can be bagged if you want to bag, or spread through your spreaders, your manure spreaders and other ways, is a good thing. Our prisons in New York State compost, 47 of our prisons compost their food waste. So our prisoners actually are learning a skill when they get to the end of their terms. They are allowed to be in composting and recycling. And I think they have to get paid. I don't know what all the deals are, but I don't know. But we figure that they're not going to escape if they only have a year left or something like that. So they learn to manage the operations at that point. And we have all different ones. This is a really, really nice building for composting. It has push walls, so 3/4 push walls that we can actually push our bucket against. So we want to be able to turn in there, and we actually compost not in windrows, in sort of windrows, but they are against the walls. So it's like there's windrows all the way around the inside of that thing. We have a wooden roof on it. We have a little bit of metal in it, but most of it is wood, because we would eat buildings. I'll take a time. We would eat buildings if it was a totally enclosed building. It would take 7 years, and we'd have holes in that building. They would eat right through the metal roofs and all that kind of stuff. So we have a sugar shack, what we call a sugar shack roof, an aerated roof, so that the air can circulate around and that the steam can come off of that and it can go out. So it really preserves the building a little bit more than anything else. So turners. This is a straddle turner, PTO driven. Where's Keith? He wanted to know about the PT. I gotcha. But that's a straddle turner. This is this is truly an organic farm. They have organic cows that eat organic feed, poop organic manure, whole thing cycles again. They also take in lakeweed and because there are a lot of lakes right there, lakeweed, and they have a lot of crops. So they have strawberries and pumpkins and chickens and turkeys and other stuff that goes in to the compost piles.
Lakeweed, is that like invasives?
Yeah, water chestnut and stuff like that.
Okay.
Yep, yeah, we pull them out of like the Erie Canal gets clogged.
Yeah.
So they'll go and mow it or pull it. A lot of people will do pulls, and that all ends up in our compost facilities. I did it out in Niagara County at one point, and we put in truckload after truckload into the municipal compost facility, because it just breaks down pretty quickly. All the vegetated parts are gone. And we intentionally move all that stuff away from any kind of water situations, or else it would populate there. So we do that intentionally, and then you don't have propagation again. Another turner, this is a one of those high tunnels that compost poultry manure, so that's all poultry manure, a big poultry farm. And that goes all through the winter. They put them under, so poultry manure, we tend to do undercover, because poultry manure, it's a fecal sac. The pee and poop is all together. So that sac doesn't have a lot of integrity. So it kind of gets liquidy and slumps. So we either dry it out or bulk it up with carbon. And if we get too much rain on it, it really, what we consider slumps. It just goes out into a flat puddle. So a lot of our poultry is done that way, and all of our poultry and all of our biosolids are done undercover, almost. I can almost say, I shouldn't say all, but almost everything is done under some kind of a roof. For biosolids, human waste, and poultry. This was set up for a butcher operation, and they actually use the 3-bin system for butcher waste. NRCS likes cement, so they put cement in there, and flat, good push walls, that kind of stuff. But one of the problems with that is there's no grace period for leachate. When it hits the cement, and then as soon as it gets to the end of that, it goes into the ground. So it doesn't really matter. You're not protecting anything there.
It'd be better to have it spread out and on soil or on soil and fabric, cloth and gravel, than to let it just go off the ground. And regulatorily wise, in New York, all of our municipalities compost on concrete or asphalt. And I just look at our regulators and I said, yeah, and as soon as that water runs off that pad, where's it going? Right down. And there's no way to stop that except for we do use some swales. So we'll use some swales to collect that leachate so that it doesn't go into the ground and it either evaporates or we pump it.
I don't know if you know this answer, since you're located in New York, but is the drainage systems used for the leachate, stormwater's fine, or do we need this sanitary?
Oh, leachate, where should it go? Leachate, generally, we're not going to have, we shouldn't, if we lay our piles out right, we have enough carbon in there, we shouldn't have much leachate. So I'll give you an example, a mortality example. We did a 1,200-pound horse. We put it on what would be equivalent of a meat board so that every bit of, we designed it, you know, we just did it with PVC pipe and stuff. But so that anything that hit that would be collected. Okay, so we had plenty of carbon under it. We had under the horse. We enveloped it in carbon and all that kind of stuff. We ended up only getting 2 liters of leachate off of that pile. 2 liters total. Everything else was absorbed into the carbon. And that's really how these things have to happen. We shouldn't, if we're putting in particularly wet material, liquids, we want to make sure that we're putting those in a lot of carbon so that they have time to be absorbed into that carbon, and then the microbes will work on all of that, and it will never hit the ground. So really, I know in the best possible world we wouldn't have leachate hitting the ground. We do end up having leachate hitting the ground because we're sometimes not careful enough with the mediums that we're composting. We'll compost blood, flaxseed, kombucha, dregs, some of the mashes and some of those liquid things. We do liquid whey, milk waste, all that kind of stuff. And we can put that into windrows. I think I told most of you yesterday about the Ben & Jerry's. So the Ben & Jerry's waste actually we build a windrow, we make a ditch in it, and we put that liquid in very slowly. And it can take 15,000 gallons in a 100-foot windrow, and we just let it soak in. And then after a while, then we'll go ahead and turn it. Or if it's really like blood or something like that from butcher operations, we'll put more carbon over top of it and let it work. It's got a lot of biological oxygen demand, so it's got a lot of nutrients in there. So we don't want that to go anywhere, so we let it sit more and we give it more carbon so that we'll have a better product in the end and we won't have any pollution issues.
So to clarify, you don't necessarily need a stormwater drain near the...
You would never release it. We never should be planning on releasing it, so no. If anything... we'll get to, if anything, I would put a berm in there, a compost berm down to absorb any water that might be running off the site. So that would filter it out. So I'll show you berms and socks. I'm hoping to get there. Multi-bin system. They work well for manure, for mortality, for other things. Mostly we use them for manure for small farms, poultry operations sometimes. This is called an earth bin, and this is a cement-walled bin. Sometimes they use them dividers with them, and it has railroad tracks on the side, and that auger just very slowly moves through the whole process. And they use these at schools, horse farms, a lot of horse farms actually in other places. I don't know about Kentucky, but a lot of horse farms will use this type because it's an easy way to be making it. It's just a really slow moving auger that moves through there, aerates everything. They put tops on them because this particular one was between a nature center who had the leaves and a school who had the food waste. and they didn't want kids falling into it. Nobody's going to get hurt. It would just be really hard to get out of there, you know, so you're not going to get engulfed. It's not that deep. So, but you just have to keep moving away from the auger.
There's one in the area,
Huh?
by Cincinnati, there's a,
You know of one?
farm, yeah.
This is Irondequoit. This is at Irondequoit, right at the bay, the gap in the bay in Rochester. So you know where that is. It's a beautiful place. So this is another way highway dividers are used, and in this one, so I'll show you that picture, but we had, this facility is digested manure. So it goes through a cow digester, a cow manure digester, alkaline or anaerobic digester, and then it comes out, and it almost looks like compost, and then it comes out. It's like separated solids. So it's in pretty good shape. Well, somebody decided that they should use forced air. So they put the blowers on it and all that kind of stuff, put the PVC pipe in, and just blew air through. Well, it was just cooling everything down. It wasn't doing anything because it pushes too much air through. So they said, okay, we'll take the blowers off. We'll just cap those and sell the blowers. So they did that. They kept the perforated PVC pipe underneath, and they use a JVC loaders that have forks so that they don't crack all their pipes. So it's a nice piece of equipment that has a long reach. And so they had the pipes under it, and still getting plenty of air, no problem. Stuff is still processing. They just didn't need any more air. And this happens time and time again with aeration. So I'm not a big proponent of forced air composting because it's not generally necessary. Fort Drum, New York, Fort Drum, we have a fort right up where I live. I was there like last week. But we had set them up like 10 years ago with some food waste composting system. And they insisted, because it's the Army, they insisted, well, we're going to have a forced air system. So as the Army works, they put the pipes in, put everything in, put the cement in, they got all that, though the blowers are on back order. So I'm like, well, just start using it. So they started using it. Temperatures are up to 130 in seconds. You know, it just flashed because it had the perforated PVC, one perforated PVC pipe right under the center, and it just worked. So they did end up buying the blower motors anyway, they just don't use them. So, because they already are on back order and stuff, but that's how they do theirs. But they have so much contamination, it's ridiculous. They just throw whole loaves of bread in, whole, you know, with the plastic bag on, everything. You know, it's just a mess. But it's not their job to compost. It's their job to defend us, I guess. So anyway, I like the ability to have some forced air, but it's not the end all and be all. And a lot of people are using forced air now, especially for food waste. I think it is helpful for food waste because food waste is wetter. And it can be helpful. But it went back to, it went back to that. So this is how they process all of their manure, and they're called Moodoo. They're in Vermont. This is biosolids composting. It's aerated. This is a place where they do need to have aeration, generally, because they've got to control things, and they have to control odors. We stink. Human manure stinks. I don't care. I've gone into facilities where I've showered out, and it's taken me 3 or 4 showers, and I still couldn't stand the way I stunk in the car to drive home. So we have to keep that odor under control as much as possible. So this is actually an outdoor, roofed, open air, and this one's in Puerto Rico. But they use a forced air system here, and it works pretty well for the need. They also do vanilla waste.
which I thought, well, that was one of the weird ones that I ran into. It's like, oh yeah, let me have some vanilla odors here. This is great. Good way to deodorize. As soon as the other guy comes back, I'll get off. I'm just wasting time right now.
You're right, you're not wasting time.
Rotating drums, we actually were using these they're a rotating drum composter, they're very large, very hard to keep warm in the winter. You don't get your thermophilic temperatures that well. So that can be, it can be useful, but what we were using them for, some of our farms started using them for, was to put manure back under, to use manure as bedding. So to put manure back under cows to save money on bedding. Because bedding is a shortage, there's a lot of shortages of bedding, we can't always get it. So we did the research that looked at the bedding recovery units. And what we found out was they really didn't need to compost it. So they really didn't need to compost the manure because once we took it out, we separated those solids, they were already heating up, and we really didn't need to do that. We needed to control the moisture so we didn't get mastitis outbreaks, but we didn't need to actually fully compost that bedding. And you'd say, oh, gross, I'm laying in my own shit, but it was working. And that's up to the farmers. I don't tell the farmers what to do. We just give them data, and they can make the decisions. So this is a vermicomposting, a commercial vermicomposting unit. And this one composts manure for 2,000 cows. They are raised beds, and you harvest from underneath. There's a scraper that goes underneath them. Worms are surface feeders, so they'll come up to the top to eat the food, and they'll process all that food for you. In this case, we were pre-processing. We were going through a thermophilic curve, and then feeding it to the worms after that, because it works a little bit better, and it works into the organic scenario where we've controlled for pathogens. And this box of gold, of worm gold, sells for, it's 1 yard, sells for $500 minimum, okay? And that's just dairy manure, a little bit of food waste, but mostly dairy manure in this facility. And they sell it to all the high-end greenhouses. In fact, the person that started it, it was his brainchild, he got all the funding to put it in. The farm actually took it away from him, and they operate it now. So working on somebody else's farm, you only have a lease. You don't have, I tell people, don't work on somebody else's farm, because they will, when they see you're making a good profit, they will kick you off. And that was the case with this situation. They were making more money on worm castings than they were on milk, selling milk. So this is that heat transfer facility, one of the heat transfer facilities. This one was actually retrofitted. So you see these channels here in the cement. Those were cut in, and this is where they suck, not blow, but they suck the air through this pile so the heat can be captured. The heat is used to, let me pop another one. So we have all kinds of air holes in there so that we can make sure that air flows. It's really hard to keep air flowing through an aerated system, and that's one of the problems with it. So there are the PVC pipes in channels. There are boards on top of those with holes in the boards, and then there's wood chips on top of that, and then the medium, the manure and all that gets put in that barn so that it can work. These are the fans. It's like a 6-volt fan or something like that pulls the air through this medium, and then it goes to isobar exchangers and is used for heating hot water or converted into electricity. And this is what their their product is. So, yep. Oh, sorry. There we go. So we go up in scale here. And this is just another one. They had 4 to 5 million BTUs per day. This is a very, very large facility, and this is the only probably mixed waste facility that we have in the country, and it's mixed waste. It's in New York City's watershed in Delaware County, which is in the middle of nowhere. So, but all of our reservoirs are up there, so they wanted more control over that. So they did that, and it has a rotating drum in it. It has picking lines, so the whole receiving area, we pick mattresses and couches and things like that out. We try not to get them that far, but buckets, you know, things that shouldn't be in there go in there. And then it goes through a line and it goes into one of those bay systems with the automatic turners. And that's the facility that I can't get the stink off of me from. So that's just the, oh, yeah, I'll do 2 more. This is the, oops, hold on. This is Ben & Jerry's, this is the Ben & Jerry's milk waste. So they put these, that's the dam. Yeah, Keith, dams.
Oh, that's okay.
And we just decant that liquid waste in out of a tanker truck and just do it slowly. Let it soak in, and then the windrow turner comes right through and mixes it all in, and they can take 15,000 gallons a week for, I think they can do it like half dozen times for that windrow. And so they're able to manage all that milk waste without any problems, without any issues.
Just what's the footprint of that site?
What's that?
What's the footprint? How many acres are they managing?
Oh, this one, it's not even there at this point. It's not Ben & Jerry's. So what's the footprint of this, of composting liquids?
Not in general, but I thought you were talking specifically about the Ben & Jerry's with the 1,500.
Oh, yeah,
I was wondering.
no, they do other materials also.
Okay.
So it's not just the Ben & Jerry's milk waste.
Gotcha.
It's other stuff as well. A lot of leaves from, this is Burlington, Vermont. So it's right down in the low area in Burlington, I think where the chip burner is, the incinerator's in there. So I think that's good.